started just researching them in 2019. It was a bird that I would see a lot of, but didn't really know that much about, other than that they were noisy and in flocks. And so over the past few years, I've become addicted to looking at jays and learning about jays, and it's just been a really fun species to work with. And just want to thank the people that I've worked really closely with on this species, Sean Connor from Biologic Incorporated and Liza Rossi. She's our avian coordinator for CPW. And let's see if I can get this to go forward. Is there a trick for making it go? Okay, there we go. Just gonna hit it a few times. So pinyon jays have come on our radar for Colorado Parks and Wildlife. We've seen a really big decline in populations based on breeding bird survey data, which isn't the best time to measure jays, but it's been consistently measured at the same time period year after year. And we've seen this decline of about 3.6% since about 1968, with an overall population loss of 83%. So when we think of other species of great conservation concern, like the greater sage grouse, this decline is greater than what we've measured for the greater sage grouse. We don't really understand why this decline is happening. Most people haven't spent a lot of time looking at pinyon jays, and so we needed to start gathering information and see what's going on with this species. Just as for your information, we just received a notice that there is going to be a petition to list the species under the Endangered Species Act. So it is becoming on the forefront for a lot of folks and agencies to be concerned with and understand what is going on with this species. So just to give you a little bit about their life history, you probably all know that they're from the corvid family, and they're very highly intelligent and clever birds. They're very vocal. I'm sure you've all heard them out flying in the pinyon juniper woodlands. They have a number of different vocalizations that they use to communicate with one another. It is a resident species in Colorado in the pinyon pine juniper woodland. They do occur in some ponderosa pines, but predominantly they're in the pinyon pine juniper woodlands. They're very highly social. And like I said, you probably see them in these flocks. Most flocks today are about 50 to 100 birds. We were pretty lucky that in 2020, we counted a flock of 800 birds, which I think is kind of a record in the last few years. And so we were pretty excited to see that, but we only saw it one time, and now our flocks are back down to 50 to 100 birds. This is a bird species that co-evolved with the pinyon pine tree, and they have developed some unique morphological and behavioral adaptations to have that co-evolutionary relationship. One, they have an expandable esophagus, so they can hold up to greater than 50 pinyon pine nuts in that esophagus and carry it off to a caching site so that they can access those seeds at a later date, predominantly in the breeding season. Some experimental studies where they brought in captive jays, they learned that they have exceptional spatial memory and can remember where they're putting those seeds. They have the large pointed bill so they can access this cone. And one interesting thing to note is that their nostrils, and you can see in this photo, this bird, there's no feathers or anything around the nostril, and that's to protect it from them getting all sappy as they access these green cones. And then what the pinyon pine tree has done is they have these big nutritious seeds that are wingless, and so they really are dependent on the avian or mammal species dispersing their seeds. So they entice the animals to come eat their seeds. They open up so that they're easily accessible, and they produce these abundant seed mass. It's really hard though to know when these seed mass are going to occur, because they only happen every 7 to 10 years, and it's more the mature trees that produce these mass crops. And so it's a nice food for the jay to have, but it's really irregular, so they can't be dependent on a certain area for trees to produce these mass seeds. And the other interesting things is these cones can take 3 years to mature. So it's a very long process as well. So hopefully we see a lot of these trees out on the landscape for jays so that they have an abundant food resource. So the cones get to be ripe towards beginning mid-April, and that's when the jays start to search the area and find these mass crops. And that's what they do in the fall, is they just spend their time collecting seeds and then caching them to be used in another season. So they can cache more than 20,000 seeds in that single fall season. And with their excellent spatial memory, they can recover 95% of those seeds. So it's pretty amazing how they can remember where they put all those seeds, but they don't get them all. So they're important that the remaining 5% are able to regerminate and form new trees and repopulate areas with pinyon pines. And this is important after fires, after, die-offs that we're currently seeing. So they're important for making these trees maintain their existence across the landscape. So jays, because this is such an unpredictable resource, can travel long distance to find these seeds, and then they can travel big distances back to their caching sites. And these are photos of a caching site that we found. They like to cache in really open areas, not very steep, in shrublands and in grasslands. And these sites can be favorable for germination for these trees. So you can see when pinyon junipers or pinyons encroaching into some of these grassland and sagebrush habitats. So how it lives through the seasons, fall is important for them to be collecting seeds and caching. Winter, the seed crop is usually depleted. Sorry, I spelled deleted, but it's depleted. Juveniles begin to disperse in winter, and you get these flocks that will roam all over looking for seed sources to eat in the wintertime, because they usually don't access their cache sites because they might be covered in snow, and they're hoping to have those for the breeding season. So they just become big wanderers across the landscape. In spring, about in February, breeding begins. And in the summertime, they splinter off into these independent feeding aggregations, and the young will gather into these creches or nurseries so that the parents can feed them and they can start to grow up. Once they start to molt, then all this signals the end of the breeding season. So we're going to focus in my presentation mainly on the breeding season because that's when we did most of our work. And this is an interesting species because it's one of the earliest nesting passerines. In Colorado, we're finding that they start nesting about mid-February. So it can be rather cold that time of year. They're considered a colonial nester, and I have that in quotes because it's not what you would normally consider a colonial nester and their array of nests across the landscape to look like. And we'll get a little bit more into that when I talk about our work. The pairs are monogamous, though they will have helpers at the nest. Those helpers predominantly help when the nesting season starts getting started, and they will be part of the colony, and then they back off until the young start to fledge, and then they'll help protect those fledging young. So like I said, courtship behaviors in Colorado, it's a little different in other parts of the range, but I'm going to focus on Colorado, is they start their courtship behaviors in mid-February to early March. And it's dependent a little bit on elevation. If you're looking in the San Luis Valley, it'll start a little bit later than where I am in Montrose, it's a little bit earlier. Both the male and female build the nest. So they go through some courtship behaviors. The male will pick up some sticks, put it in a tree, see if the female likes it. And once he finds a good location, they'll both start building nests. And I've watched them, and it's just back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And they can usually finish a nest in about 5 to 7 days. And then the female, she puts on the last touches by putting the duff inside the nest. And you can watch her I can watch them build a nest from a distance, and then I can watch her line the nest, and she'll lay in it, see if it's comfy, move around, see if it's really comfy, and then she'll start her egg laying process. Again, these nests are very well insulated because they breed early. So they're lined, and one diagnostic characteristic is they're lined with juniper bark. Sorry, I'm getting my trees mixed up. So you can see this top nest has some juniper bark lining that nest. The number of eggs laid varies from 2 to 5, but most commonly you're going to see 4. They have 1 brood per year, but they will try and renest if the first nest fails. The female incubates the young for 17 days. The male does not incubate. He just brings her food, but he'll stand as a sentinel and guard that nest and make sure that she's okay. And then he'll go get food, and then she'll get off the nest and beg, and he'll feed her, and then he'll go off again. The female will stay on the nest after the eggs hatch and brood the young. This is a little bit dependent on the size of the brood, but usually it takes 8 to 10 days before she'll start leaving the nest to feed with the male as well. Nestlings fledge at about 22 to 24 days, and they pretty much leave this colony area where everybody's nesting a day or 2 after they fledge, and then they'll move in and form these creches. And you can just, it's so loud when these young are together and they're just begging from the adults. So it gets to be a really noisy time, but really super fun to watch the fledglings because they're pretty clumsy, but pretty fun to watch. So now that you've kind of got an idea a little bit about the bird, there's a lot to learn about pinyon jays, and you can talk about pinyon jays for a long period of time. But I'm going to talk a little bit about our research and what we did to help understand the pinyon jay, and maybe provide us with some information on what may be some of the reasons that these populations are declining. So we started with a large-scale survey, and we basically did this because we didn't know anything about the jays, where they nested. We just have some eBird information. We have some, breeding bird survey information, but we know most of that's collected at the end of the breeding season. So we decided that we would set up these grids within pinyon juniper habitat, and these were big grids. They were 10 kilometer by 10 kilometers, so a huge area. But then we arrayed point counts every kilometer within this grid along roads and on trails. So you can see this is the grid, this is a road, and these are our point counts along the roads and off on some trails where we had access to survey. And we would play a 6-minute point count or listen for 6 minutes to see if we could find jays. And if we found jays, then we would look for breeding behaviors and then try and follow the jay to see if we could locate a colony. So these again are our point counts where we ran our point counts to try and check jays. And then this is where we found a jay that was showing some courtship behavior, and these are our walking tracks to try and follow that jay to locate a colony. And it just took a lot of time watching the jays, listening to the jays, because you can get certain vocalizations during the breeding season that will cue you into what they're doing. And we just would spend a lot of time looking for nests. We had to define a colony with this survey method by seeing an actual female incubating eggs or nestlings in a nest to make sure it was an actual colony location. And so the results are, we did some point counts. Here's a nest tree, and here's that nest in there. So then we knew that we could define this as an active breeding area or a colony. And from that first step in locating jays and just where they were breeding, we were able to locate a number of colonies. So you can see on this map that pinyon jays that were detected but no colony confirmed were the yellow squares. So we found a lot of pinyon jays that we couldn't find colonies with. And again, it was hard because we actually had to find a female on a nest or nestlings in the nest. And sometimes that takes a lot of time, and we only had a day to try and determine it. And then the red is where we found colonies. So actual birds on nests. And you can see we had a good array across the state. And the black is where we didn't find any birds whatsoever. So this was the first step in just trying to see if we could even locate colonies, where they were breeding in the state, just a first effort at a large scale to locate these breeding areas. And the reason we wanted to look at breeding areas is because the one time that these birds are not moving around too much, and we're hoping that we can assess some other question with these breeding areas to help understand the species. Okay, this is not moving forward again. Okay, we were doing good. There we go. So from this survey effort, we did learn that it takes a lot of patience to interpret pinyon jay behavior and then to find those nests. And that one thing is that we need to be really careful when we're out there walking around colonies, trying to find these nests or understand courtship behaviors, because these jays are extremely vigilant. There are sentinels watching your every move. And sometimes when you go in there, they'll try and mob you. So you have to be really careful so that they don't detect you, or that you're sneaky enough that they just don't bother calling you out and that you can actually observe the birds. But we did find that if you can identify some of these behaviors, and there's quite a long list of them, you can be pretty sure that you're in a colony area, which is very helpful for future survey efforts. So some of the other lessons that we learned is that breeding habitat is often at the edges of pinyon juniper woodland and not in really thick pinyon juniper forests. So this is a colony in San Luis Valley, and the colony is basically in these open trees here along this grassland and on this side of the hill as well. So you can see it's pretty open, and they really seem to prefer these openings in these shrublands and grasslands. This is another example of a colony. Most of the colony is around this open grassland area. And what I mean is I would rarely, or we haven't found like a colony up in here where you would have just thick, dense pinyon juniper woodland with no openings. These birds have their cache sites and openings, so they like to have, you know, their colonies near openings, and they also like to forage on the ground looking for insects and seeds. So that may be why they're also nesting near these open areas. But we have a lot to learn, and everything that we're learning right now is on the breeding sites. So we need to understand fall behaviors and movements, winter, as well as summer. But this is the first step in what we've been able to do with the bird. These are some examples of colony sites, just some more examples so you can see where they're breeding. They liked to breed in this drainage area here. Then they went up this hill back in here, and behind this hill that looked very similar to have their colony area. And this is an example of a nest tree. So this is that same colony. They seem to prefer some drainage areas. You can see in this topographic map, a lot of the nests are in these drainage areas, not as many on the ridge tops. So they will use them, but it seems like sometimes they like the little thicker trees next to the openings versus the more open areas with not that edge kind of as you go into the thicker trees. This is another example of a colony in gypsum, an eagle colony. So the colony where they're nesting hills, again, it borders this sage. Here's a nest tree. So it's just kind of giving you some examples of where these colonies are, which surprised me. I didn't know they would be. And the nesting occurred within these pinyon juniper woodlands intermixed with this sagebrush habitat. Again, another nest tree. And then this is the San Luis Valley that I showed you previously. Again, kind of hanging out in the nests along these hill slopes and interspersed with these open areas. Again, this is a nest tree. Just gives you a feel of what these colony locations look like. And this is of concern because a lot of these areas is where all the habitat treatments for reducing fuel loads, for doing treatments for big game, removing pinyon juniper for gunnison and greater sagegrass treatments are happening. And so we really need to recognize where these colonies are and consider pinyon jays as we're pushing forward with these treatments. Because with the infrastructure bill and all the additional monies that are coming to reduce the pinyon juniper footprint, we need to really think about what we're going to be doing to pinyon jays by doing that. So now that was our big scale effort just to, you know, can we find colonies? Can we locate birds? Can we identify pinyon jay breeding behaviors? And can we find nests? So once we got, like, we could do this, we wanted to do some more intensive work, more just at the colony level scale, so we could understand or what the birds were doing at their colonies. So this is a more of a small scale research project where we wanted to evaluate site fidelity to breeding colony sites. We wanted to evaluate nesting and fledging success and potential threats to reproduction. Maybe that's what's causing some of these declines, is they're just not having a lot of good reproductive output. And then we wanted to map colony extent and if these colonies moved much from year to year, and this would help inform treatments that might be might be being done on the landscape for, like I said, fuels reduction and for other species. So for site fidelity, from that big effort, we identified 23 colonies, and we went back to those 23 colonies over 2 years, and we visited them 3 times during the breeding season to see if we could document breeding behaviors, we could document nests, and just see if they were returning to the same colony areas year after year after year. And this to me is always a funny photo, because this is what the females do when they leave the nest, and they tell their mate that they're very, very hungry and they're very loud. So he feeds her, and I don't know if you can see this on your picture, but you can see she has a lot of pine nuts in her mouth right there. But this is another way to find nests, is the females come up off their nest, beg, and then they'll go straight back to their nest. So that's one way we would locate active nests. So these are the 23 colonies that we assessed. The blue ones are the ones that we found active every year. The yellow ones we didn't find active every year. This one up here, this Blue Mountain one, was actually sort of a disappointment, because we went up there in February to check for breeding behaviors, and a mastication or a fuels reduction project was being done to remove the pinyon juniper woodland. And so they had basically destroyed the whole colony area. We continued to look for birds in the area to see if we could pick out where they moved, but we just couldn't find them at all. And I just was reading a book, I don't know if any of you've heard of it, but it's a book called The Pinyon Jay, and it was a lot of years of research by Balda and Marsloff near Flagstaff, Arizona. And I just read a sentence where they were saying that there was a huge effort to remove pinyon juniper woodlands, and they just said that when you do that, it totally disrupts the pinyon jays, and some of them die and some of them just move, and they couldn't figure out where they went. So it's kind of what we saw at Blue Mountain with that disruption with the pinyon juniper removal. So when we were going back to these colonies, we were finding that we could locate a number of nests to help age the colonies and know if we had high site fidelity. And so we broke these nests into classification. Class 1 was a recently active nest. We could age them from about 1 to 3 years. Class 2 was an older nest. It still had a lot of large stick volume and some nice vertical structure, but the cup was usually filled with a bunch of debris, and the ceiling had bubbled up to the top. Class 3 is a very old, dilapidated nest that maybe could have been out there for as long as 10 years. So we were learning that we could start aging these colonies not only on just a few years of seeing if the birds come back, but also doing these nest searches to see, 1, the extent of the colony, and 2, how long has this colony been in the area. And a class 4 is kind of one on its own. The pinyon jays will sometimes start to build a nest and not complete it. It's a courtship thing that they do. And so we were also running into these as well. And so these are just some photos of the nest that we classified. So this is a class 1 nest. And you can see that, it's really clean. The cup is really deep. It's got nice structure. And a lot of times we knew that these nests stayed this fresh because we had found nests in 2019, and then 3 years later, they could still look really clean and nice. And so that's why we kind of came up with that age classifications. There's many times where I'd walk up to a nest and go, yay, found a new nest being built, and then look at my GPS unit and someone had already documented that nest the year prior or the year prior to that. So we knew that they could look pretty nice for several years. This is a class 2 nest, so it's probably older than 3 years old. There's a lot of debris in it. The cup isn't as clean. You can see this nest, all this stuff is bubbling up, so it's just not a real nice cup anymore. And this is a class 3 nest, just no lining in this nest anymore. It's just falling out of the tree. This one just kind of has some lining, but the sticks are all gone. So these are older nests that we think are older than 6 years old. And then the last class is a class 4 nest where the birds start to build a nest and then don't like it, or it's just a courtship nest, and then you just kind of see this nice pile of sticks. But we did realize, though, when we were looking for nests and mapping colonies, that we had to make sure that we were actually mapping pinyon jay nests. Scrub jay nests can get a little confusing, but again, one of the diagnostic characteristics is one the tree is in. So you can see this is a pinyon jay nest, and it's in a serviceberry, so you would never find a pinyon jay nest in a serviceberry. It's always in a pinyon or a juniper's tree that we've been able to discover yet. And also this is a scrub jay on their nest, and you can see the little white eyebrow looking at you. So you're like, darn it, that's a scrub jay. And they can overlap their nesting. It's a little bit later, but they can be on the nest at the same time a pinyon jay is on their nest. So we had to make sure we really could identify the nest. Again, this nest doesn't have any juniper lining. It's really grassy and not as deep. So another indicator that it's not a pinyon jay nest. And then the eggs look different. If you ever see the bird, if you ever run into a nest with just the eggs, the pinyon jay eggs are not as brown and splotchy, and it's not as green of a color as this Woodhouse's scrub jay nest. And just looking at this nest, again, you have the juniper the juniper lining and the really grassy lining for the scrub jay nest. And then the other overlap species that will nest early is the Clark's nutcracker. So we had to make sure that we weren't classifying those nests as well. And they look a little bit different, and they place them in the trees a bit different than the pinyon jays do. So we also looked at nesting and fledging success. From those 23 colonies, we did find that nest activity varied from just one nest being active all the way up to 29 nests being active in a colony. We did find that females were found incubating as early as 28 February, and that was in 2020. And the first nest that we found in 2021 was 7 of March, but we also started with a bigger snow cover in 2021 than we did 2020. We did find that most of the nesting activity was over by about the end of May. Colonies were just silent. Birds weren't in the area anymore. The birds had left the area. Fledglings had left the area. So all of a sudden it gets really, really silent in May. We did, from that map that I showed you, 4 colonies had no nesting activity. However, we did find birds in the area, and the birds will forego nesting if there aren't good food resources. So that may be an indication that they're just not finding the masting trees or able to access food to go ahead and try nesting that year. We did find that nesting success was actually pretty decent at about 64%. The one thing that was a little disheartening is the fledging success. So the nesting success is taking the eggs from laying to hatch. And fledging success is all the nestlings growing up until they fledge out of the nest. Our fledging success was pretty low, and that was a bit of a disappointment. And this was across all colonies, all 23 colonies that we measured. The majority of nest loss was due to raven predation. Ravens hunt these pinyon jay colonies very hard. They nest right next to a lot of pinyon jay colonies. We can watch from a distance, and the pairs of ravens will just swoop around the colony and just flap at the trees trying to get a response, especially if there's nestlings in the tree. They'll just flap at them. If they hear something, then they just land and poke their head in. This is a raven that is actually eating a baby pinyon jay nestling. And they definitely seem to hit them harder when the chicks are nestlings. It may be just that they can recognize it easier with all the feeding bouts to and back from the nest, but it's a concern on what ravens are doing to pinyon jays. Other predators that we detected were great horned owls, not very often. A few nests where other jays had poked holes as kind of indication that another jay had disturb the nest and poke some holes. And then we had some nest predation due to squirrels and other rodent species, but these were very, very limited compared to the raven predation. So taking those nests that we located, we were able to map the colony sizes that we were visiting for those 23 colonies, and we found that they could be relatively big or they could be small. So they varied anywhere from 37 to over 1,500 acres, and this is using all the old and the new active nests that we located. And if we only concentrated on active nests, so those that had females incubating nestlings and ones that had fledgling young, the colony area was much smaller. 86 to 400 acres was measured in 2020 and up to 484 acres in 2021. So it's smaller, but we need to keep in mind that these colony areas aren't static and they'll move from year to year in different locations. We did find that active nests in a colony can be as close as 4 meters apart, and they can be as far as 2.5 kilometers apart. So a colony isn't a colony for sure. And colony locations can move up to 2.4 kilometers. So these are some examples of our colony areas, and I know it's a bit busy, but the the pink dots, these are active nests in 2020. The purple squares are active nests in 2021, and the red, yellow, and green triangles are those nest classifications. So you can see a mix of age classes of nests. And this is an interesting colony because this is near my house, and I found birds nesting in this general vicinity in 2019, but I didn't have time to really follow the colony. And then we found them nesting again here in 2020. Hence the pink dots. Then in 2021, we could not find any birds in this area. I never saw them trying to cache food, nothing, just silence. And then we heard them, and so we walked up here and found all this nesting activity up here in 2021. And then this last December, I was walking here and I started seeing birds caching food all in their old caching locations that they used in 2020, and then this year they're nesting up in this location again. So it seems like this flock nested here 2 years, here, and now they're back here. So it's really kind of interesting, and we're seeing that they reuse the cache sites. So this is the importance when we're thinking about habitat treatments, considering the whole area that these birds are using. And then you can see how close it is to this agricultural frontier. Great place to find ravens, not so positive for the pinyon jays. This is just another example of a colony. We didn't find very many nests in 2020, but in 2021, they nested up here as well as over here. And there's a smattering of mixed age classes of nests within this area. This year, they're nesting a little bit more up here through this drainage, so they're still in the same location, but again, they're coming around, and so it's important to know how they use their landscape. This is another colony, and this one is more like tight. They seem to like the same area year after year, so just considering that when we do habitat treatments. And this is a colony, another example that they moved almost every year. They moved to 2020, they nested here. 2021, they nested here, and there's probably a lot more nests, but this country was just incredibly difficult to access. And so and we didn't find a lot of mixing of older or a lot of older nests. And this colony, it moves a lot, and this colony had the lowest raven predation. It is the farthest from any kind of agricultural urban interface, but it's interesting that they seem to move the location of their nesting from year to year. These are some example of nest trees that we found nests in, and I kind of find it fascinating because they can use a lot of different types of trees. These are very young, small trees. This tree is actually in the middle of a treated area. And so they use this tree, and she actually successfully fledged young. Then they can use these, older trees that are really healthy, got thick twig density to hide the nest. I would say this is the most common type of tree that they use. But again, you see these nest trees are pretty open, which was surprising to me. And then they'll even use these really old, mature, decadent trees. This juniper is very old with this basal area, and this tree is also very old. So they use a variety of nesting trees. So again, it's hard to tell people, well, this is the type of tree you need to look for to not to cut down that they're going to use for nesting. We did find that nest heights ranged were quite variable, but the average height was about 13 feet of the nest tree. So you can see that pretty commonly they use those younger, a little more mature trees for nesting. Nest height also varied from as low as 2 feet off the ground to 23 feet, but average nest height was about 6.7 feet. So anywhere between 6 and 8 feet, you normally would find a nest. And we found nests only in Utah juniper, Rocky Mountain juniper, and pinyon pine. And most of the nests, I didn't put the percentage in here, but about 70% of the nests were in one of the juniper species. So what are the lessons we've learned from our survey efforts? One, pinyon jays have high site fidelity to breeding colonies. So it's important for us to locate these breeding colonies in Colorado and try and protect them, because we don't know what will happen if we disrupt the breeding colony, but we do know it's one site that they use year after year after year. And the areas that they use for breeding colonies overlap where we're trying to do a lot of our pinyon juniper removal. So identifying them is very important. We did find that if we're doing this colony work, we need to be really cognizant of not disrupting the jays, also not having ravens detect us and maybe help them find nesting areas. So we're developing a protocol that people don't need to go in and find those nests during the breeding season. It's just recognizing some courtship behavior, and you'll be in a colony location and you can do your nest searching in the summertime where you won't disturb the breeding birds. So we're trying to educate other land managers on being aware of pinyon jays and how to find them, and then go back in time to find those nests that you can classify. And then just knowing that colonies are fluid. Just because you make one boundary, it may take you several years to really understand where that colony is and how much it might change from year to year. And a lot of people try to base, colony locations on fledged young. And one thing that we found is they will leave the colony pretty quickly after they fledge. So just concentrating where you're finding fledged young doesn't show you where a colony is. And there's a lot of concern for a number of species about raven predation, from sage grouse to desert tortoises. And so they may be an issue for pinyon jays as well. And that may be part of the reason that they may be declining across the range. And another final thing that we need to start considering is pinyon jays when we're doing fuel reduction treatments or trying to improve habitat for other species. We really need to take a holistic look at what all the impacts are to not just those sagebrush species, but the pinyon juniper species as well. And I just like to acknowledge all my wonderful survey technicians that found, I didn't even put in the number of nests that we found, but we found 1,710 nests that were able to map all these colonies and age these colonies. And so I was really thankful for my survey technicians. I had support on GIS and analysis from John Runge and Michelle Flinner from CPW. And those large scale surveys were done pretty much by Biologic, the technicians, Jim Lefevre and Adam Petrie. And with that, I'll take questions.